Welcome to another episode of the Meter Cute interviews here on Meter and Mayhem. In this episode, I'll be sitting down with Annie Finch, an American poet, writer, translator, speaker, teacher, and performer. She's the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently, Spells, New and Selected Poems. Her other works include influential essays, books, and anthologies on poetics, feminism, and women's earth-based spirituality. Widely recognized for her mesmerizing poetry performances and mastery of poetic craft, her poetry has appeared in the New York Times, Poetry Magazine, Paris Review, and the Penguin Book of 20th Century American Poetry, just to name a few places. Those are some pretty cool places. Are you ready to find out what else she has in store for us today? Then sit back, relax, and get ready to fall in love.
This is Annie Finch in Costa Rica. So happy to be here. And I'm going to read, because this is Meter Cute, I'm going to read 5 poems, one each in 5 different meters. To Enheduanna, after 4,500 years, an invocation to a muse. A quote from Enheduanna, a priestess of Inanna, The Descent of Inanna, 23rd century BC, translated by Kramer and Volkstein. From the great above, she opened her ear to the great below. From the great above, the goddess opened her ear to the great below. From the great above, Inanna opened her ear to the great below. Once you blazed down a goddess through the 7th cold gate, till she crawled to the underworld on bended knee, you of honey sweet voice and of most bitter fate. For 3 days, for 3 nights, as the stars wheeled and ate, her contentiousness and disobedience shook like a key. Once you blazed down a goddess through the 7th cold gate, and you bowed her, you stripped off her ornaments, wait till she hung on the hook of revenge and cruelty, you of honey sweet voice and of most bitter fate. Strong-haired reader and writer in stone and in state, abused mother of poets who named yourself proudly. Once you blazed down a goddess through the 7th cold gate, and you found her again. Bring us home to your great queen of heaven. Bring us now, as strong as she's free, you of honey sweet voice and of most bitter fate. Come and burn in us now, when it's nearly too late, as we turn toward the touch of our freedom to be. You who blazed down a goddess through the 7th cold gate, let your honey sweet voice heal our most bitter fate. This is for Sylvia Plath, the You. She takes me in, deep in, till I'm exiled, then pricks my ankles with small bats and owls. The moon's my mother. She grows bald and wild, turning us through our blue nights, long beguiled, dark needing light. Though every steeple scowls, that door is open. I will be her child. Which is our face? Was it ours till we smiled? 8 great tongues find a 9th that sprouts and prowls. The moon's my mother. She grows bald and wild, singing the touch that's still unreconciled, spinning out the inheritance of growls. The door is open. I will be her child, as Mary was before they made her mild. Gather our draping hoods, our snoods, our cowls. The moon's my mother. She grows bald and wild. The door is open. I will be her child. binding spell. He who wastes a woman's will burns in flames that never still. He who mocks a woman's mind will be ruined by the wind. He who abuses a woman's body, Mother Earth won't feed nor bury. He who hurts a woman's heart rots where tears and oceans start. He who hides a woman's spirit loses his own birth within it. This is a prayer to the goddess dedicated to Hart Crane. A quote from Crane's poem For the Marriage of Faustus and Helen. Inevitable, the body of the world weeps in inventive dust for the hiatus that winks above it, blew it in your breasts. Weeping for thee, we will weep up the ground with our glittered hexagonals, sweeping the sound of thy lost ashore music, thy rain curling true past our tears, sparking light through the patterns and bars, burning dark through the trails of such solace, such stars to thy breasts. Dust is always the language we use. Its hiatus is winking each moment to sigh out our body's inventiveness, worlds reaching thy bluet breasts. There is always this language for you. The spirals at hand. My sisters, we're burning, but not in that fire. The spirals at hand where we love, rule, and flower our world into life. It's our time to inspire, my sisters. We're burning, but not in that fire. Our witchy souls fly home to truth and desire, turning at last in our own sacred fire, my sisters. We're burning, but not in that fire. The spirals at hand where we love, rule, and flower. Thank you.
Wow, Annie, that, that was that was just absolutely magical. I loved that so much. Thank you for reading for us. Um,
So good to be in a place where I know people will care about the meter. Very exciting to me.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was listening, and it was so funny because as I was listening, there was one that I felt more of a connection to, and when I started to think, I was like, "Oh, it's Anapest, of course, of course, it's Anapest for me."
Oh, that's your meter.
Yes. Um, so I love your writing. Can you tell me about someone's writing who you love?
I have had so much fun thinking about this question because there are a million to pick from. I even mentioned it to my husband, and he was like, "Oh, wow, that's gonna be something," because there are so many. But I am going to pick Hart Crane, a poet I love so much, and I just read a poem to the goddess that's based on his poem. And uh, it's interesting because I'm teaching a class right now in blank verse, which is their name for iambic pentameter, which I actually argued with the head of the program I'm teaching for, because I was like, I use blank verse to include all different meters that are unrhymed. I don't use it only to mean iambic pentameter, but he meant iambic pentameter, so we kind of compromised that I would do only iambic pentameter, and then at the end I'd bring in some other meters. But it's forced me to go back into iambic pentameter, and I've been reading Hart Crane again with his iambic pentameter blank verse, and it's just amazing. So I'm going to read my favorite passage, though the bridge is a close second, but from The Marriage of Faustus and Helen. This is an excerpt from the poem. Hart Crane. The mind has shown itself at times too much the baked and labeled dough divided by accepted multitudes. Across the stacked partitions of the day, across the memoranda, baseball scores, the stenographic smiles and stock quotations, smutty wings flash out equivocations. The mind is brushed by sparrow wings. Numbers rebuffed by asphalt crowd the margins of the day, accent the curves, conveying diverse dawns on every corner to druggist, barber, and tobacconist, until the graduate opacities of evening take them away as suddenly to somewhere virginal, perhaps, less fragmentary, cool. There is the world dimensional for those untwisted by the love of things irreconcilable. And yet, suppose some evening I forgot the fare and transfer, yet got by that way without recall, lost yet poised in traffic. Then I might find your eyes across an aisle, still flickering with those prefigurations, prodigal yet uncontested now, half rient before the jerky window frame. There is some way, I think, to touch those hands of yours that count the nights stippled with pink and green advertisements. And now, before its arteries turn dark, I would have you meet this bartered blood. Imminent in his dream, none better knows the white wafer cheek of love, or offers words lightly as moonlight on the eaves meets snow. Reflective conversion of all things at your deep blush, when ecstasies thread the limbs and belly, when rainbows spread impinging on the throat and sides, inevitable, the body of the world weeps in inventive dust for the hiatus that winks above it, fluid in your breasts. The earth may glide diaphanous to death, but if I lift my arms, it is to bend to you who turned away once, Helen, knowing the press of troubled hands, too alternate with steel and soil to hold you endlessly. I meet you, therefore, in that eventual flame you found in final chains, no captive then beyond their million brittle bloodshot eyes. White through white cities passed on to assume that world which comes to each of us alone. Except a lone eye riveted to your plane, bent axle of devotion along companion ways that beat continuous to hourless days, one inconspicuous, glowing orb of praise. Hart Crane.
Wow. Wow. Oh, the earth may glide diaphanate. Like, dang.
I know, I know. To alternate with steel and soil to love you endlessly. Oh my gosh.
Um, so tell me a little bit about what what about Hart Crane speaks to you?
Hmm. Well, I love the way it's so wild. Like it's so wild. It's just like, catching fire alive that's still burning. Like I don't know half of what it means, and I don't care. Like it just makes sense in a way that's, it would be abstract, but it also makes sense. Like grammatically, it makes sense. And when I do try to figure it out, it makes sense. And there's a famous letter he wrote to Harriet Monroe where she was like, "What is this?" It was about Melville's tomb. She was like, "This doesn't make sense." And he went through, he explained every single thing. So, yeah, I know it makes sense, the logic, but it doesn't matter. It's like, I love the way it respects and honors the reality of the mind and syntax and logic the way, it's the way I try to live my life. Like I respect and honor the reality of the physical world and things that need to be there for sanity, because I've been insane. I know what it's like. It's no fun. I really like sanity. I like logic and things to hold together. But at the same time, he manages to apparently do all that and at the same time be completely wild, like holding on to this naked fire and doing them both at once in their extreme, honoring them both somehow at once. It just blows me away. And it's just also so gorgeous. It's just really because it's beautiful. I grew up with it. Both of my parents actually loved Hart Crane, and they used to read. They didn't that poem they never read. They loved Voyages, especially. My father used to read that, and my elegy to my father also has a quote from Hart Crane from Voyages at the beginning of it that I wrote when he died in 1980, no, 97. But yeah, so I grew up with it, and that made it easier, I guess, for me to absorb it. But I also have this kind of underdog passion for Hart Crane because there was a long time when he was just out of style. And I remember one time being at the AWP conference, and the it was like the panel was like, how can we even teach Hart Crane? Like that was the name of the panel. And everybody was ratting on Hart Crane, how self-indulgent he was and how over the top and how tacky. And, and I was just in the audience going crazy. So I just love to, share him and bring him back now that there seems to be more tolerance for him.
There do seem to be like trends, right? Like where people come in and out of fashion, and it's
Yeah, right.
infuriating sometimes.
Yeah, it is. I know. I mean, if you live long enough, it's sort of fun because you begin to see that the things that really irked you do go out of fashion, and it's kind of fun, and things that you care about do come back. Like, I guess if you grow up on one end of the pendulum and you live long enough to see the other end, it's going to feel satisfying because if it bugged you in the beginning, you're going to end up being happier. So, yeah, that's the fun about being around around 60, you start to notice that. It's very satisfying. It's like 2 generations have gone by, right? So, yeah.
That is something to look forward to.
Wait long enough, live long enough, and you can outlast a lot of shit.
Yeah. Yo.
Good reason to be healthy.
Huh?
Good reason to try to stay healthy.
Yeah. Um, like I had another question. Oh, because is Hart Crane, so sometimes I get details wrong. But I have him associated with Brooklyn. Is that true or no?
Yes, because
Okay.
To Brooklyn Bridge is the poem To Brooklyn Bridge is the other poem I was tempted to read the beginning of. Yeah, yeah, he was actually the heir to like the Lifesaver candy fortune, but his family disowned him because he was gay, and he lived, I guess, in Brooklyn, and hung out a lot by the docks, having affairs with sailors, and killed himself in his 30s. Pretty tragic life. But yeah, I guess he was living in Brooklyn at the time, and now I'm living there. So that's interesting to think about. I kind of forgot that. But yeah, he had this wonderful epic ambition, and Brooklyn Bridge he made it into a symbol that he thought would be the symbol for like a new world, a new liberated American modern world. The, yeah, that's a beautiful poem too. In fact, those are I remember when I was working in New York in my early 20s, and I had my little Hart Crane, this really ratty paperback, which I still have somewhere. And I just remember I would sit on the subway and try to read his poem To Brooklyn Bridge. And I never got beyond the first 2 or 3 pages because I just kept reading it over and over and over and over. And the subway ride was not that long, and I would just sit there and let the words sink in. And the first 3 words of that book, how many dawns? So it begins the proem, like the prologue to Brooklyn Bridge, begins, how many dawns chill from his rippling rest, The seagull's wings shall dip and pivot him, shedding white rings of tumult, building high over the chained bay waters, liberty. I'm just going to say that again. I mean, the syntax is like, it's like Milton or something. It's so amazing. This is one sentence. How many dawns chill from his rippling rest? The seagull's wings shall dip and pivot him, shedding white rings of tumult, building high over the chained bay waters, liberty. I believe in saying things 3 times, as you know. Speak it thrice. I didn't do it with my poems, but I'm going to do it for these 4 lines of Crane.
Please.
How dawns chill from his rippling rest, the seagull's wings shall dip and pivot him, shedding white rings of tumult, building high over the chained bay waters, liberty. And this is a poem addressed to Brooklyn Bridge. So the chained bay waters, I think, is the bridge chaining them. I'm not even sure what he had in mind, but those 3 first words, how many dawns? It's like a question, right? But I couldn't get them out of my head sitting there in the subway when I was, whatever, 23 or something. I would just look at those 3 words, how many dawns, like trying to figure out how the emphasis was, how the stress was, like, because they're almost identically stressed, but how many dawns? But it's like an adverb, an adjective, and a noun, and they each one syllable of each is equally stressed. And the syntax, I just find it so amazing. It's like the tolling of a bell, and I just have never been able to get those 3 syllables out of those 4 syllables out of my head. There's something about him.
Wow.
I just think he's a magician.
Um, have you ever, so with those 3 words, with those 4 syllables that you have that you can't get out of your head, um, how does that affect your work? Do you feel like those words are there with you always, or how does that affect you?
That's such a great question. I mean, in the poems I just read are all from my new book or my new manuscript, which is complete now. It's taken me like 15 years to cast it into these 5 meters. And this is the poem that I read in the Dactyls, the one to Hart Crane, weeping for thy bluet breasts. That's based on a Hart Crane quote. And I started writing that poem in I think it was 1995. So was that 30 years ago? It was a completely different poem then, completely different. And I only finished it now, with this book, like last year. So, it took 30 years to get that tribute to Crane. And I haven't ever put those 3 words from his other poem, from the Brooklyn Bridge, into a poem, but now I'm thinking about it. It's a great thought to do that. I feel that it trained my ear so much to weigh those syllables over and over and over against each other and try to understand how they were working, to take that incantation and turn it into a meaningful language, and I never could. Like, it's still an incantation to me. So I think the process of really getting into those syllables so deeply may have been a big factor in me going metrically diverse, because he's writing iambic pentameter, right? Like, how many dawns? It's like, it's an iamb, how many dawns, and then chill from is a trochee, right? So he's got 1 trochee, and the how many dawns is the 3rd foot is a trochee, and then he goes back into iambs. So it's weird to have, I guess it's a sort of a caesura, how many dawns. So he's got a trochee after a slight caesura in the 3rd foot. But you can all, if you hear it as a dactyl, but how many dawns? Like if it's more of a question, then it really is the beginning of a dactylic poem, right? So how many dawns? So I think that might have started me on just the path of realizing there was something subversive in meter, that this blank verse I had been raised on, iambic pentameter blank verse I'd been raised on, Milton and Wordsworth. And just recently teaching this class I was telling you about, I've become aware how much the world has changed since I came up. And so many of my earlier poems are in iambic pentameter because that's all I knew. And now I teach in meter magic spiral, and I'm always talking about metrical diversity. And people would be like, how come this poem is not in dactyls? It's such an emotional poem. And you say dactyls is the meter of the heart. And I'm like, yeah, when I wrote it, I didn't really know about dactyls. All I knew was what I was taught, which was iambic. So, I was still very much in the iambic spell because that's the hegemonic meter, the only one that most people knew. But I think the way he was grappling with, in just starting his epic poem, his long poem with those 3 syllables, the 4 syllables that are bringing dactylic right into it, it might have helped me begin to sense that there was another way.
Excellent. I have a question. You sort of started to touch on this, but I'm curious. You've said that that some folks use blank verse to only mean iambic pentameter blank verse, but you use it with more metrical diversity. Can you because I've only ever heard it applied to iambic pentameter. So I'm curious, I don't know, where the metrical diversity comes in, and if are you sort of like a maverick trailblazer on that, or are there other folks who are sort of on the same train with you?
I'm, I think I am a maverick trailblazer on it because, if only for the simple reason that I'm a maverick trailblazer in terms of metrical diversity in general. Like, you know, just in writing any other meter besides iambic, I think I am. I mean, even the few people who are doing it, like Annalena Phillips Bell or whatever, I mean, she was my student. Patricia Smith, she's got those trochaic poems. She was my student. So, I don't know anybody else who has a serious interest in non-iambic meter for its own sake, except maybe Jennifer Reeser, who I met later. But yeah, so I am a maverick trailblazer in this way. And when I began to realize, there's an essay that I wrote called Metrical Diversity, and I first articulated it for a book called Meter in English, a symposium by Robert Wallace, where they got about 25 poets who were interested in meter, and they had them address these different issues. And Robert Wallace was trying to make the point in his book that iambic meter was the only meter in English, and that we should just accept this fact. Like Robert Frost said, there's only strict iambic and loose iambic, that's it. And so Robert Wallace believed that everything, I know, that like every poem, even if it looks like it's in trochees, it's really an iambic. You just have to put like an extra cup at the beginning of every single line of Hiawatha or whatever. I don't know.
That's working pretty hard there.
Yeah, right. I think it was in the early 90s. And, nobody was objecting because nobody was writing meter and nobody paid any attention to any of it. So but I had already done my PhD work on the ghost of meter, the semiotics of meter, and I had already noticed the power, and I was already starting to write in other meters like dactyls based on my dissertation research for the ghost of meter. I was like, if I'm going to be honest, I have to write dactyls myself, because uncovering the semiotics, I was like, that's the only reason I ever started doing that, Jen. Like, started the whole thing was because I got that PhD, and I researched it, and I'm reading, it was all right there in Dickinson and Whitman. I scanned every syllable of Dickinson and Whitman, and I looked at the patterns, and I just thought about it. And what I discovered was that right there in the poetry was very clear that dactyls were the meter of liberation. And so I had to start writing them, to be honest with myself. But I had never done it. I hardly knew of any in the world, and it was scary. And that's when I wrote Among the Goddesses, was like my way of learning to write in dactyls. But so yeah, I was the trailblazer. So then when I got so excited about metrical diversity and articulated it in this essay for this book, Meter in English, and I began to realize, yeah, this is a thing. I believe this. That the hegemony of iambic just doesn't exist. And I was at Stanford and there were a lot of linguists there and I would check in with them. I sat in all the linguistic seminars and I really checked it out very thoroughly. And I discovered that it was bullshit. Like what my teacher wrote on the board when I was in my MA program at Houston, she wrote on the board, English falls naturally into iambics. Cynthia MacDonald, the poet, wrote that. And it's a dactylic phrase, right? English falls naturally into iambics. And I'm sitting there in her class, and of course, nobody knows a thing about meter, but I happen to know it because I went to Yale and they taught it to me. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is the total lie. This is the most self-evident lie I've ever seen. She's saying it in dactyls, but she's saying that it falls into iambics. And she doesn't even know that she's doing it because she can't even scan dactyls. And she was my teacher. And that's when I just realized that I had a responsibility to try to do something about this situation. So I also realized that nobody cared about meter or prosody and that I could basically make up my own stuff because nobody was noticing or paying attention. So I tried to be very responsible about it, but I did make up a lot of stuff in my book, A Poet's Craft, or A Poet's Ear, same material in both. That's where I really did everything I could. And based on my teaching, I was teaching a lot. So my students helped a lot figure stuff out. I was just teaching meter constantly, but I came up with a lot of rules for how do you substitute trochees and how do you substitute anapes and, do the rules for falling feet, like trochees and dactyls, those rules are actually opposite to the rules for iambic and anapestic, right? Because they're working the opposite way. So, we figured it all out and I made up some names. I didn't make up the names cup, wand, and edge until later after that book was published, unfortunately. So they're not in there, but they're in my new book, How to Scan a Poem. Cups, wands, and edges, meaning unstressed syllables, stress syllables, and foot boundaries. Very useful terminology. So simple. If you're going to keep repeating these words, these concepts, you need to have simple words for them. So I made those up too. But when it came to blank verse, it was in A Poet's Craft, A Poet's Ear that I was just feeling pretty confident that, okay, I'm doing my best. I'm making up stuff because the stuff doesn't exist. It needs to exist. So I also decided at that point that blank verse does not have to be iambic. And if you look it up, it really doesn't. It basically just means unrhymed verse, right? But the term was invented at a time when iambic pentameter was so accepted as the only serious meter for poetry in English. If there were anapests or whatever, they were for kids, they were for illiterate people. It was classist, it was sexist, it was ageist. But iambic pentameter was the only serious meter for adults. And that was the way it was for 500 years, right? At least, something like that. So during those hundreds of years, those centuries, they made up this word blank verse, assuming that verse meant iambic pentameter. That's all, that was it. And that's how it's still used by certain people, like the dear person who runs this school I happen to be teaching in. But I put it in writing in Poet's Craft when I realized the importance of metrical diversity. That what are you going to call unrhymed anapests? What are you going to call unrhymed trochees? Are you going to make up a different terminology for each meter? It made no sense. So especially the more that we write in other meters, which is starting to happen, I take credit for a lot of that, which I'm happy to do, having worked my butt off to make it happen. But yeah, so why not? If we're going to write in other meters, why not just say blank anapestic verse, blank iambic verse, blank trochaic verse? Like, it just makes sense. Like, you're not going to make up a separate terminology for each meter and just make blank verse always be iambic, even though the other meters are so amazingly wonderful. And iambic is just one among the others. I'm very convinced that this is the future of poetry in English meter is going to be metrical diversity. It's obvious.
I love it. I am on board. I mean, you already know that, but yeah, I am on board. So I'm wondering, something else that I'm wondering about is, if you could go back to either that Annie sitting in a classroom watching the teacher speak in dactyls, but saying there's only I ams, or maybe that Annie sitting on the subway trying to make it through Hart Crane, but just loving that beginning and getting stuck there. What advice would you give that one of those earlier Annies?
I love that question so much, and I had so much fun thinking about it. And I was like, wow, hang out with women more. Don't worry, don't build your life around men. That was a good one. There were lots of wonderful things I would have told myself. But being this Meter Cute interview, I would say I would definitely have told her in the beginning, hey, you don't have to write I ams. You don't have to. But just give yourself the room to try other meters. I mean, and they were around, right? They were around in kids' poetry or whatever. My ear wasn't attuned to them because I was well educated. And so it was all iambic. But I think looking back for this, teaching this blank verse class now, I went back and looked at my own iambic pentameter poems. There's one called Inside the Violet, which I think to me is it seems like the answer to Wordsworth or to the Romantics in general. It's in blank verse, but it's about how like I'm not going to look in that violet anymore because it looked back at me. It was very, very feminist. I was thinking a lot about subject and object and all that stuff. But yeah, so looking back, I see that I was struggling so hard against the dominance of iambic pentameter, and yet I was writing in it so much. And I think I cut myself off from a lot. And I think I caused myself a lot of personal grief as a human being, not just poetic restriction, but also just a lot of unhappiness by focusing so much on iambic, which I now think is the meter of the mind. And I didn't really start writing those other meters until after I finished my PhD and thought, hey, wait a minute, I've got to write dactyls or else I'm going to be making a liar out of myself. So that's a long time. I was writing a lot of poems before I finished my PhD, and I wish I could tell that self, stretch out, relax, get stoned, and write another meter for a change.
There you go. Well, do you think that she would have any advice for you if she could get in like a time machine and see you now, like pop into Costa Rica with you there? What do you think she would say?
I'm pretty sure she would say, um, she and all the earlier selves to her, also, I think that they would tell me to do something I've been wanting to do for years and haven't really seriously done it yet, but is to write children's poetry, like to really do it. I want to write children's poetry that's witchy and goddessy, and I want to write a series of poems about goddess myths and things like that, um, and use different meters for them and really allow kids to hear those different meters. So yeah, I think that might be something she would tell me. I was trying to think of other things too, because I guess that's not the most important thing, but I don't know. I was thinking, I bet when I was in my 40s and 50s, like my younger self would have had a lot to tell me, but a lot of my maturing has been a reclamation of my younger selves. So I feel like a lot of that is already with me, but I haven't done the writing in children's poetry yet.
Excellent. Well, I will look forward to seeing the book of children's poetry come out from you at some point. I'll keep my eye out for that. Um, it has been an absolute delight to get to chat with you this evening, Annie. Thank you for coming on and talking with me.
It's been wonderful too. I love it. I love this whole thing. Meter cute. I love it. Thank you so much, Jen. What a treat. What great questions. So just for a last word, I just want to say my little motto with a hashtag in front, speak it thrice. This is my advice for my own poetry and actually for any poetry in meter is speak it thrice, say it aloud, really feel it. And that's the best way to appreciate it.
Wow, what a great interview that was, right? If I do say so myself. Uh, I mean, I enjoy and love doing all of the interviews because if I didn't, I wouldn't do them, right? Like no one's paying me, I'm not required for any degree program or job or anything. I'm just doing them because it's fun. And so if it ever stopped being fun, I wouldn't do it. I have to say, that one was incredibly fun. Partially because I kind of owe the fact that I am still a poet today to Annie. Uh, I had a rough if you watch some of my other videos, I had kind of a rough time after my PhD, and it was only, I think, because uh I went to Marge Piercy's intensive writing workshop that she used to do every summer up in on Cape Cod. I went to that one summer, and then I eventually found my way to Annie's Poetry Witch community online and the classes that she offered there at the time. And really, I think without those two experiences, I wouldn't be the poet that I am today. I wouldn't be the person that I am today. And so I owe a huge debt of gratitude to the work that Annie does with metrical diversity. And um yeah, I do love IAMs. I'm not anti IAMs. I am a person of the mind and fire and will. So I do love my IAMs. I do love my anapests. But but I think that her outlook on meter and how accessible she makes it, how she shows you the roots of it and shows you that it is something that has been out there among the people. Um, is it weird to like be talking about something being accessible and then use the word among? Maybe. I don't know. But yeah, that's because my brain is just full with like, wow, yeah, I would not be the writer that I am today had I not um gotten hooked up with Annie Finch and the meter classes that she teaches. So if you ever have the opportunity, take one of her classes. It will change your life, I think. Definitely change your life. And if you go to my Substack and you do the writing prompts regularly that I do each Sunday or whenever I release them. I think I'm changing to Fridays, but maybe I'll still do the prompts on Sundays. Who knows? Anyway, if you do the prompts every week, I'm not going to edit this out. I'm very tired. I don't want to. Editing takes a lot of work. I don't want to do it. Um, if you do the prompts, you will also notice I talk a lot about the concept of enrhythming. And I always give you a poem to enrhythm with before you go to write. Even if you're writing fiction, even if you're writing essays, whatever you're writing, I still think enrhythming, I mean, Annie talks about it specifically just for poetry. I think there's something to doing it before you write prose as well. I think it adds a different layer to your writing. And Annie is who I got that term enrhythming from. So much that I owe to her, and I hope that you all enjoyed our little chat. Thanks for stopping by.